Hi, my name is Dan Goldman, and I'm going to be presenting on my capstone project for University of Wisconsin-Madison. So this is going to be relating to the bat research I've been doing over this past summer with the Urban Ecology Center and how it ties into white-nose syndrome. To start, let's talk about what white-nose syndrome is. So this is a fungal disease that disrupts hibernation for bats. It's caused by the Pseudogymonascus destructans, or PD fungus. And basically what it does is it causes fungal growth on the bats' bodies, on the exterior, that disrupts their hibernation. No cure exists for it currently. There are some techniques that people have used to try and manage it, such as mounting ultraviolet lights at the entrances of caves, and then trying to sort of shine those lights on the bats as they fly in for their final hibernation before the winter. And basically the reason for this is because the fungal growth is actually very susceptible to ultraviolet light. So even just a quick blast is usually enough to remove any of the fungus that's found on the bats, at least on the outside. But the problem is that this is obviously not very practical as a widespread solution, because it's difficult for us to know exactly where bats are going to be hibernating, and trying to mount those lights is going to be expensive and can also be disruptive. The way that the fungus disturbs the bats is it will basically cause them to have a shorter torpor period, and torpor is sort of the sleeping phase of hibernation, which I'll go into a little bit more on my next slide. But basically it makes it so they wake up more frequently, which causes them to expend more energy. And part of the reason that this fungus has been so successful against bats is because the same types of environments that they prefer for hibernating in, so typically cool, damp caves, also happen to be the same type of environments that the PD fungus will thrive in. It originally probably came from Europe. There's a very similar fungus over there that the native bats in Europe are immune to, but what probably happened was a person accidentally brought it over from Europe to the Americas, and then it started to spread from there. It was first detected in a cave in upstate New York back in 2006, and then since then has started to spread across the country, to the point now where it is in 33 US states and 7 Canadian provinces. So I want to go into a little bit more detail about what hibernation is. So as many of you probably know, this is basically when animals are asleep through the winter, and allows them to conserve energy to survive either adverse weather conditions or the lack of food caused by that. As I mentioned, torpor is the rest phase of hibernation. Many mammals will arouse briefly throughout hibernation, including bats. This is perfectly normal and natural. What usually happens is they'll wake up for a period of 1 to 2 hours, and then they'll resume their torpor or their sleep phase. And it's not fully understood why this happens, but it happens in pretty much every mammal that hibernates. So it's assumed to be something that's beneficial to them in some way. And this is also, interestingly, these waking up periods are where they use up most of their energy reserves that they have stored. So these wake up periods account for 80 to 90% of the energy expenditure that they have throughout hibernation. And then the remaining 10 to 20% is what they live off of while they're in their torpor phase. The problem with white-nose syndrome is that it causes more frequent arousal. So they have shorter torpor phases and wake up more often. And so because the normal arousal periods already use up so much energy, having additional ones makes it even worse for the bats. So that way they don't have enough energy to carry them through to the end of the season. I want to talk about the bats of Wisconsin because there are two types. Not all bats in Wisconsin are necessarily susceptible to white-nose syndrome. The first type are cave bats. So these include the big brown bat, the little brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, and the tricolor, which is formerly known as the eastern pipistrelle. These bats are going to hibernate typically during the winter, usually in caves or mines or even sometimes buildings. And then these are the 4 species that are susceptible to white-nose syndrome. whereas the other types of bats are tree bats, and these are the eastern red, the silver-haired, and the hoary bats. They typically migrate for the winter. They might have a brief hibernation period, like usually on their journey, but they don't hibernate throughout the entire season. Instead, they'll usually fly south to Mexico or Central America, or maybe even the southern US. And they have been found to have PD, the fungus that causes white-nose syndrome, but they don't display the actual fungal growth on their exteriors and haven't shown to have any sort of mortality caused by white-nose syndrome. One thing to note is that of the 4 cave bat species, little browns, northern long-ears, and tricoloreds are the ones that are the most susceptible to white-nose syndrome. Big brown bats can be affected by it and can die from it, but seem to have a much greater resistance than the other 3 species, and this is hypothesized to be because they are a larger species of bat, hence the name, and so they have greater fat reserves that can tide them over for the winter, even with the additional arousal that white-nose syndrome can cause. I want to focus a little bit on the little brown bats because of the species that are susceptible that we've been able to collect data on, this is perhaps the one that we've been able to examine the most at the Urban Ecology Center. And additionally, I've been able to find more studies about the effects of white-nose syndrome on little brown bats than I have on any of the other species that are found in Wisconsin. So to prepare for hibernation, these guys go from a 7% body fat ratio during the summer to 27% right before hibernation. So that's a pretty big jump. It's going to be over a quarter of their body mass right before they go into hibernation. When they wake up, they'll wake up for 1 to 2 hours every 12 to 20 days. This only accounts for 1% of the time that they're in hibernation, but it accounts for 80 to 90% of the energy that they spend. And in areas where white-nose syndrome has been found in little brown bats, it tends to have a 91% mortality among them. So these are one of the most susceptible populations to white-nose syndrome in Wisconsin. I'd like to transition quick to talking about the research at the Urban Ecology Center and sort of what I've been doing working with Ethan over this summer. So the main types of research that we do are acoustic monitoring. This is done with the stationary detector located at Riverside Park that runs all year, and then with mobile surveys that are done at all 3 parks throughout usually the spring, summer, and sometimes into the fall. Once we have collected data, the data gets sent to the DNR to verify basically what we're hearing and what we're seeing. So sometimes we have a device that can automatically identify what types of calls a bat is making, or like what species it is, but it's not always guaranteed to be correct. So we send it to the DNR to basically look it over and sort of give us a more verifiable species identification, and then they send that data back to us, as well as sort of keeping it for themselves to kind of put together with other data that they're being sent from all of Wisconsin to get a picture of how the bat population of the state is doing. So just to show you guys a quick example, this is a spectrogram reading from an echometer device. So this shows the call of an eastern red bat, and you can tell that it's an eastern red bat because of this little yellow symbol with the code LASBOR, which is the 6-letter symbol for eastern red bats. And you can see very clearly that there are these sort of reverse Nike swoosh figures in the spectrogram. So those are very clear and easy to spot examples of a bat call. But sometimes the auto identification gets it wrong. So like here, we can see that the calls are a lot fuzzier and it's a lot harder to see any sort of distinct shape to them. But if you look at the top, in the yellow, it still says LASBOR, which is the eastern red code. So this is probably a case where background noise was mistakenly attributed to being an eastern red bat call. So as I mentioned, we have a few different ways to collect this acoustic monitoring data. So the first is the stationary detector, which you can see on the right here. So this is located at Riverside Park. It runs year round. So obviously the advantage of this is that we're able to collect a lot more data with it, but the downside is that it's only for one location. And then we also do the mobile surveys which we use two types of devices for. The first is an Anabat device, which is sort of an older technology that's designed specifically for collecting bat call data. And it's the same thing that's used at the stationary detector, actually. That's also an Anabat. The advantage of this is that it's really good for the playback of calls while you're in the field. But we've generally found that it's not quite as effective at picking up calls as the other type of device we have, which is the echo meter. And so this is actually just that little red box you can see on top of the iPad in the upper left picture. Basically, it's a little microphone that you can buy for $180 that is able to then plug into an iPad or a Galaxy tablet or similar device. It is attuned to the frequencies that bats make their calls at. So typically their calls are at a range of like 20,000 to at least 20,000 hertz, which is like above our hearing range, which is why we don't hear them. But the microphones are designed to be able to pick those up. And then the echo meter, what's really nice is that while you're in the field, it will do those automatic identifications of the calls. So you can at least get an idea, even if you can't totally rely on it to say that, yes, this was definitely an Eastern red bat, as opposed to possibly being a different type of bat or just background noise. This is a map showing the spread of WhiteNose syndrome. So in New York, it's a little difficult to see, but there's a little red circle that shows the very first site where WhiteNose syndrome was found back in 2006. And then cooler colors represent earlier detection of WhiteNose syndrome, and warmer colors represent more recent detection. I only have data up to 2019. I suspect that the pandemic kind of had an effect on the data collection for WhiteNose syndrome studies. So I haven't been able to find anything from 2020 or 2021, unfortunately. As of 2019, WhiteNose syndrome has not yet been detected in Milwaukee County. So my findings have generally shown that, and this is mostly data from the stationary detector, which I'll get into a little bit why that is later. But generally, there's been a downward trend amongst detection of both cave bats and tree bats. So this data that I have access to goes back to 2007. So it's about 14 years worth of data. And WhiteNose syndrome first showed up in Wisconsin in 2014. So it's kind of a nice balance of 7 years before WhiteNose syndrome was ever present, and then 7 years after it first showed up in the state. Again, it didn't show up in Washington County until 2017. So that's sort of the inflection point I've been using in some of my later analysis. But generally, it's difficult to draw conclusions because of the fact that the tree bat populations have also been dipping along with the cave bats. So that would seem to indicate that whatever's been causing the populations to decrease probably affects both types of bats, which probably means it's not WhiteNose syndrome. That said, though, that's obviously not a guarantee. Let's see. One thing to mention is that big brown bats are far and away the most common species of bat. They were before WhiteNose syndrome was even a thing, and they are still to this day. So because of that, you might see that the blue line that represents the cave bats is generally higher than the tree bat population. But when you remove big browns from that, it tends to be lower because the other three types are less common. And actually, I should correct myself because I've been saying population, which is a bit misleading, because the way that these acoustic surveys work is we're picking up the calls of these bats, but that's not a way for us to necessarily determine the population of bats in the area, because you might get a call from the same bat multiple times, so that can throw off your whole estimate. So instead, what we're doing is more evaluating the ratio of calls by species. So what's the proportion of cave bats versus tree bats that we're getting? What's the proportion of each individual species of cave bat that's susceptible to WhiteNose syndrome that we're getting? So it's sort of comparing the total number of calls across years and the ratio of calls between species. So here's a table that shows 3 of our 4 cave bat species. I didn't include the northern long-eared because the stationary detector has picked up so little data from them, as in it's generally single digits or 0 every year. So it's not enough to really be statistically significant. And as a matter of fact, the mobile surveys have never picked up a northern long-eared or a tricolor for that matter. The mobile surveys have only ever picked up big browns and little browns as far as cave bat species go. But what you can see is that the boxes here that are in light blue are years that are pre-WhiteNose syndrome for Washington County. And so I'm also carrying that assumption over to Milwaukee County. And then red is after possible introduction of WhiteNose syndrome. And generally, there seems to be a downward trend at first, with 2014 kind of being the low point. And then the calls have started to pick up again since then. So I'm not sure if this is because of changes in the bat population, or if it's something to do with perhaps the equipment that was being used. Maybe the equipment that was used back in 2007 is different from what's being used now, and maybe it was more or less effective, or something has changed. So it's difficult for us to say exactly how the population has changed. That said, I did perform an analysis of variance comparing the calls that we've gotten from each of the 3 cave bat species, and I found a p-value of 0.89. So what that indicates is that if you have a hypothesis that WhiteNose syndrome has had an impact on the cave bat populations, or that there's been a significant change in the cave bat population since WhiteNose syndrome was possibly introduced, there's an 89% chance that that hypothesis is incorrect. So that's actually good news for bats. It basically means that in all probability, WhiteNose syndrome has not made it to Milwaukee County, or has not had a substantial impact on Milwaukee County bats as of yet. But continued monitoring is, as I mentioned before, very important. We want to make sure that if things start to take a turn, that we're able to catch it right away, so that way the DNR or other organizations are able to help with possibly mitigating the spread of WhiteNose syndrome. So some of the challenges and successes I've had working with the UECs. So one of the big ones was remote work and lingering effects of COVID. So I, until recently, was living in Madison. So I was doing most of my work with the Urban Ecology Center remotely. And then, as I mentioned earlier, like there isn't really there was sort of a dearth of data from before or from after 2019. And I suspect that COVID probably had a hand to play in that. Another sort of challenge that I faced in putting this project together was the sort of different types of data collection and formats. So for mobile surveys, for example, there's been a year where there was only 1 survey, and then there have been years where there were 13 surveys. So the amount of surveys per year varied a lot, which makes it difficult to sort of measure those data on equal grounds. What I wound up doing was dividing all of the survey periods into 15-minute blocks, and then figuring out like what's the average number of bats found per 15-minute block for every year, and then comparing those numbers to try and get a better picture with the mobile data. And I'm actually still in the process of sort of finishing that up, which is why I haven't presented that information yet. It's a little tedious trying to get all of that information into sort of a common format to compare it. And then there have also been some differences in methodology. So specifically, the Echometer device is fairly new. The UEC first got it in 2019. And so all of the surveys before that only relied on Anabat, but since then, they've used either Echometer and Anabat, or just Echometer for a lot of surveys. So I have to, I'm still working on sort of accounting for how much the method of data collection affects the data. As I mentioned, the Echometer seems to be better generally at picking up bat calls than the Anabat. So an increase in the amount of calls that we're seeing in 2019 and 2020 might be attributed to the fact that using an Echometer device means that they're better able to pick them up, rather than an actual increase in the amount of bat calls that were being made in the first place. But I do think that I've had a lot of success in my work with the Urban Ecology Center. So I've done 2 virtual lectures now, or almost done 2, I guess. And I felt pretty happy with those. And I hope that you guys have enjoyed them. I've been able to help out a lot with the data collection. So being able to work with Ethan and with volunteers to go out and conduct the mobile surveys, and then also helping with managing the stationary bat data and working with the DNR to analyze the data that we collect. Additionally, I created some digital survey forms to help with other types of surveys, such as odonates and monarch butterflies. And it's also just been a real pleasure being able to work with the UEC staff and with community members such as yourselves. I've always enjoyed whenever I've gotten to go out and do bat surveys, other types of surveys, or participate in these virtual lectures, even just as a fellow attendee. It's always a blast to learn something new about, such varied topics as what's covered in these. And so I'm going to have some deliverables for the UEC. So I'm going to be writing up a report that will detail my methods, and this will include both like how we collected the data and then how I analyzed it, as well as conclusions about WhiteNose syndrome. As I've mentioned, I'm still in the process of this, but my general belief is that WhiteNose syndrome has not really had a significant impact on Milwaukee bats as of yet, but it's something that needs to be watched. I'll be providing a sort of a summary document for the UEC communities that will be more accessible for people who don't necessarily know as much about bats or about WhiteNose syndrome. I've got these 2 virtual presentations that I've completed, and in this picture, you can see me showing some volunteers on one of our bat surveys how the echometer device works and kind of explaining what we're doing and why we do it. So just to sort of wrap up, it's been really great working with the Urban Ecology Center. I loved being able to put my passion about bats into something that helps inform the community, because I think that bats are often, they're maligned for a number of reasons, COVID being one of them, unfortunately. So any chance I get to sort of be a bat brand ambassador is always welcome for me. And with that, I will take any questions.